Good evening, everyone. Thanks all for being here. It's just about 7 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started with our class. Since moving here, I guess this is my first time in front of you in a semi-casual setting, so I'm excited about that. This is also my first time teaching a Bible class of a group of people that are not my peers, that aren't 12 years old in a cabin or that I went to school with. So any comments, any questions? Well, maybe no questions, but any comments or thoughts that you want to add to the class would be very much appreciated. In just a second, we'll have a prayer, but before that, I'd like to sort of outline the night, and then we'll go and see if we have any church family business that we need to pray for. So my theme tonight is captivity and restoration, and I kind of went back and forth on deciding how I wanted to tackle this, if I wanted to do a strictly divided kingdom approach to this, or if I just wanted to look holistically at the Old Testament and go through and look at characters and groups, or however you want to put it, different characters and figures for looking at their captivities and at their restorations from whatever situation that they've been in. So we'll be looking at that tonight. In this class before, in the quarter, we've looked at people who have been lowered, like Jonah, in the belly of the fish, or like Isaac, people that are bound or trapped in some way, but then are restored to life for furtherment of God's kingdom. I'd like to start by saying where we're going to end, which of course is going to be Jesus on the cross. And obviously, in all the instances that we look at tonight, God allowed these captivities and failures to take place because of sin that the people had. Obviously, in these instances tonight, God allowed the person or people to be restored because of their continued service to Him or their penitent heart. And then even more obviously, we fit that pattern of falling prey to sin because Satan is great at what he does and driving that wedge between ourselves and God with sin, but then we're restored and made clean by the blood of Jesus. So we've got some big chunks of text, some little text, so if you see those come up and you want to read one, just go ahead and get started. My slides tonight don't exactly have points that directly coincide with what I have in my notes, but are mostly there just to sort of maybe spark something in your head, or if you see something that relates to that I haven't said, go ahead and bring that up and we'll talk about that. We could make it through all my material tonight before the bell, or we might not make through any of it. I guess we'll see. But I guess let's go ahead and get started. Is there any business that we need to discuss before we pray? All right, Matt.
What's all about? God in heaven, we thank you for your grace to us and your patience with us. We're grateful for your word as it teaches us, feeds our souls. We're thankful for the liberty from sin that we have in your Son, the liberty to truly live. We will live forever with you. Lord, we thank you for all that you've done for us. We're humbled. We're grateful for your love. Be with us now and always. It's through your Son that we pray.
Amen. Thank you, Matt. So, like I said, we're going to look sort of holistically at the Old Testament tonight for this theme of captivity and restoration. So I want to start just by asking, what are stories or examples of people that come to mind when you think of captivity and restoration in the Old Testament?
Joseph?
Yeah, Joseph. That's one we'll look at tonight.
I didn't hear what you said, but not knowing what you said, I'm going to say the children of Israel and Egypt.
Yeah, children of Israel. We're not going to cover Israel or Egypt as much tonight because I know Nick is teaching on Moses next week, and then our next quarter is about the life of Moses. So I'm sure that Israel will come up at some point during that quarter. So.
Our recent class on Daniel.
Yeah, we'll talk about, I don't think we're talking about Daniel specifically, but we'll talk about that group of exiles for sure. All right, let's go ahead and jump into it. The first one that I've got tonight is the flood, Noah and the flood. And for each case, at some point throughout, we're going to establish our root cause and the need that God saw for these people to be taken captive, and then the effect, I guess, or the restoration that took place. And Genesis 5 helps to paint a pretty good picture. If you want to go ahead and turn over there, we'll be there for just a few minutes. Genesis 5 helps to paint a pretty good picture in my mind for this need that God saw for the flood. In Genesis 5, 6 through 20, there's a ton of examples of all these people in the genealogy of Adam who lived, and he lived and he died, and he lived and he died. And I'm sure we've heard Ryan talk about that before, but then we get to Enoch, and it says he walked with God and that he didn't die. And the idea being that if we live like everyone else, we die like everyone else. But if we don't live like everyone else, then we don't die like everyone else, especially in a case like Enoch. We see there's a problem since the garden, the problem of sin, and as people wandered east, building cities for themselves, making names for themselves and not for God, without giving him credit or giving him glory. They sort of took their page and made a life that was not very acceptable to him. And we get to Noah in that genealogy in chapter 5, verse 26. And it says, that's the wrong verse, 29 is the right verse. And called his name Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord had cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. So we've got this character that comes onto the scene whose name means or sounds like the Hebrew word for relief. And another word that we can use for this is rest. And we'll talk about that again in just a second. But if someone wants to go ahead and read Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 through 8. Genesis 6, 5 through 8.
The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things, and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord.
So we see that wickedness was so great and so rampant in the earth that God had created. It says that he regretted making man on earth. And I did a little word search, and the phrase or the idea of God regretting something only came up 3 times in Scripture. And I can't remember what one of them was. Then one of them was this one, and then the third was when Saul had sort of gone off the rails, and King Saul, and had been living his own life, and God had regretted bringing him into power to be a king for Israel. But to me, this seems like a pretty big deal, God regretting a decision that he made. We regret things that we do in our lives, right? Words we might use in conversations, or things we might do in the company of others, maybe in a more familiar or personal instance, working too much and not spending enough time with family. There are things that we might go on and regret. But God regretted making the entirety of humanity, and it grieved him to his heart, is what Genesis says. And whenever we regret things, we have some typical responses. Maybe it's just to sort of sweep it under the rug and forget about it. Or maybe it's just to move on and pretend it didn't happen. There's instances like that. Sometimes, for sure, our regular response as Christians, I feel, should be to be more accountable for how we live our lives and working to correct wrongs we might have made. And we have that here. We have God seeing his creation wicked and corrupt people, as verse 11 says. So we see there's a correction that he sees needs to be made. He plans to wipe everyone out, but he also plans to build it back, as we know. He makes provision for Noah and his family to be saved, to pass through the flood, and he does, and they come out the other side with this newly washed earth, ready to be filled with a more godly, reverent people, which is why God chose Noah in the first place. Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And they built God an altar, and they made a sacrifice, but of course we know that reverence doesn't really last. And in chapter 9, verse 29, we get another, and he died, talking about Noah. So we have our cause of captivity. We have evil people on the earth, wicked and violent. But then we have our restoration that happened through what happened with the flood, which brought about cleansing, brought about new life, and an opportunity for godly living. Has anyone got any comments they want to throw out or anything? Yeah.
I don't know exactly where in the Bible it says it, but God says he's going to destroy the earth by a flood. And then in 2 Peter, when God comes back, he's going to destroy the earth a second time.
Yeah, it's easy to look at this sort of pattern that we see of destruction from God for people who aren't living godly lives. Yeah, that's totally right.
brought out, yes, there's promise, yes, there's cleansing, but it's new life. Which I think is awesome. That we get to see God creating, not just man and woman at the beginning, but he's always creating, even now when we die to our sins, he's creating anew.
Yeah, awesome. So we'll go ahead and move on to our next one, which is Joseph. And the story of Joseph starts in Genesis 37, if you want to make your way over there, just a little chunk of pages to your right. Up until a few months ago, I always looked at Joseph and I couldn't decide between these two ideas of Joseph, whether he was just some punk kid who liked to brag to his brothers and his family about the way that he was getting dreams and about them all bowing down to him, or if it was just him just sort of being a little ignorant about life and talking to his brothers, not realizing how that would make them feel. But I'm sure as a 17-year-old, which I was some years ago, 7 years ago maybe, it's kind of funny to look at that. Obviously, it's like, oh, if you're your father's favorite son out of 12 and you get all these things and you have these dreams, it'd be kind of hard to not get a big head in that situation. So when he goes and tells his brothers that they're going to bow down to him, I'm sure that paints him in not the best of light. But all that to say, Joseph is one of those instances where we have someone who was faithful, but God uses him as an instrument to bring about life and peace in the future. So let's go through that just a little bit. There's a bunch of different points in Joseph's life where he sort of goes through this little wave of ups and downs, and we'll try and hit a couple of those. The first one is him being captive by jealousy. And I kind of changed the words around for how I headed these and how they're up there on the board. But I changed those around a little bit. If I could get someone to read Genesis 37, 18 to 24.
They saw him from afar, but before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, and there was no water in it.
So when we look at this, there's kind of two motivations that I see Joseph's brothers having them. One is mentioned, one is not, but it's pretty obvious. So what would you say that those two motives are for throwing him in this pit?
Well, they wanted to kill him, but then they conceded to just get rid of him.
Yeah.
You know, let somebody else deal with it.
I'll give you a hint. One of them is the first one on the left up there. Is jealousy, right? And that's the one that's not listed here. And then the one that is hatred. And that's what I see when I look at these reasons. I mean, it's hard for me to see, that those aren't valid reasons. Obviously, it's not valid that they wanted to kill their brother, but those are valid things that built up to these brothers feeling like that. And it's hard for me to see anything else from these brothers. And they wanted to go as far as killing him, but then Reuben came in and said, "No, let's not kill him. Let's just throw him in this pit." And those things like hatred and jealousy are very corrosive. We see it with Cain in Genesis 4 when he made a sacrifice that wasn't as pleasing as Abel did, so he goes out and he kills his brother. We see it in King Saul, and we talked about him last Sunday night a good bit, where his jealousy for David drove him to attempt to kill David multiple times. But as we see and as we saw, there are multiple ways out for the righteous. And then on the other side of that chart, we'll have restoration from the pit, which is sort of the main idea that I'm working on for this Joseph point. So if I can get someone to read Genesis 37, 25 through 28, and then verse 36 as well.
Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from took Joseph to Egypt. Did you say 36?
Yes, please.
Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard.
Great, thank you. So that kind of leads me down two trains of thought. One is that they kind of just got lucky, I think, that these Midianites came along and they threw him in this pit, and it makes a note about there not being water in the pit and that it was empty. So it was kind of like what Mark said, is they left him there to probably die, was probably some of their intention with putting him there. But then my second thing that comes to mind is just that things, even though they're not great from an outward view looking at Joseph, nothing had really changed sort of looking at his life a little bit. If we want to go ahead and skip to chapter 39, Genesis 39, and I'm going to read 1 through 6. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in the house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was of all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. So as we look at this, and the Lord is still very obviously with Joseph. In verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph. Verse 3, the Lord was with him. The Lord caused all that he did to succeed. In verse 3, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. Verse 5. And right off the bat, in this new part of Joseph's life, he's already been lifted up to this very high honor, where he definitely shouldn't be as just some regular person who was sold to this Egyptian officer. But Potiphar sees who he is and what he can do, he being God. But he adds him to his house and to his work and elevates him that way. So we have this obvious, I feel like, captive to death, stuck in the pit, and then restored to life. And not just any kind of life, but a very successful life for Joseph. Then we can move on to the second one, where Joseph is captive by lies. And we'll read Genesis 39, 6, the end of verse 6 to 18. And this is a bit of a longer one, so I'll go ahead and knock that out. Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He's not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept anything back from me, except you, because you're his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lay beside her, or to be with her. But one day when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her house and fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he's brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as he heard, I lifted up my voice and cried out. He left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house." That's repeated again. But then 18, but as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. So at this point in the narrative, Joseph has already been set above all things that Potiphar has, and has control over them, except for the obvious exclusion that we see here of Potiphar's wife. So he recognizes that would be disrespect not only to his master, but he makes note that it would be a sin against God, the one who'd blessed him and made his life so successful after having risen from the pit. Potiphar's wife then concocts a lie about Joseph, one which incriminates him, and Potiphar really doesn't have any choice because of what he hears and what he sees to just listen and believe that it's true. And then in verse 19 and 20 of chapter 39, as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him in the prison the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. So he's back again. He's back at the bottom of this loop that he's on. He's stuck in what we can probably assume is a prison that's meant for lifetime prisoners, the king's prisoners, which we can probably assume are some sort of assassination attempts or insurrectionists who tried to commit acts against Pharaoh, and they were put here for life or possibly until execution. And they were sentenced to that same pit as Joseph, who we know did nothing wrong. And we've got a second restoration from this second pit that he's in. If I can get someone to read Genesis 39, 21 through 23.
21 through 23. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. Whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed.
So again, we've got this hopeless scenario where Joseph is being brought up from being a lowly prisoner to being the man in charge of all the prisoners. He was elevated and trusted to a place where the prison keeper didn't even have to pay attention to what Joseph was doing and the things that he did, because everything that he did was successful because God was with him, restoring him to new places because of his godly living. And then we have our third captivity that's going to take place. And I titled this one Captivity by Forgetfulness. And I put all of Genesis 40 down. We're not going to read that. There's a couple of verses we'll read in just a second. But Joseph was placed in charge of two people. We see a cupbearer and we see a baker. And they'd had dreams that were uninterpretable, but with God, Joseph was able to interpret both of those dreams for them. And we'll read just a small snippet here in Genesis 40, 9 through 15, if someone can read that.
So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream, behold, there was a vine in front of me. In the vine were 3 branches, and it was budding. Its blossoms came out, and its clusters produced ripe grapes. Now Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, so I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. And you will put Pharaoh's cup into his hand, according to your former custom when you were his cupbearer. Only keep me in mind when it goes well with you, and please do me kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing that should have put me into this dungeon.
So we've got this cupbearer, and his dream was interpreted, and it was in his favor. And Joseph, please, he says, mention my name before your boss. So he knows who I am, and he knows that I'm here for no reason, truly. But as we see, the cupbearer was restored to his position with the Pharaoh, and we read in verse 23, the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And this, I feel like, speaks a lot to how we live our lives, sort of in a pit, in a valley where things just aren't great, aren't going for us. But once we make it out, we don't ever stop to appreciate the one who got us out. It reminds me of Psalm 6, verse 1. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul makes it boast in the Lord. Let the humble hear and be glad. Verse 4. I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me away from all my fears. It reminds me of the 12 lepers that we read about in the gospel, where only one of them returned to thank Jesus. And of course, they had their duty that Jesus told them to go and speak to the priests to show that they were clean. But still, we see the one turn back and praise Jesus, while 11 went away and no words of praise were offered back to Jesus. We oftentimes do this. I oftentimes do this, and I look at life and I see that I look back and I've come out of this place, but then I don't take the time to thank the Creator who brought me out of that valley. And we've got one more restoration that we're going to hit really quick, which is another restoration from the pit. So I'm going to read Genesis 41, verse 1, and then 9 and 13. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And in verse 9, Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream of his own interpretation. The young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. So I forgot to write it down, but we can do a little bit of quick math here. And Joseph has probably been, in the next chapter, we'll see that he's 30 years old. So the 2 years before that, he would have been 28. And then the first time that we see an age of Joseph, he's 17 years old. So that's 11 years potentially that he could have been just in slavery or in Potiphar's house or in this prison just waiting. And we have these 2 years where I'm sure that every hopeful thought that Joseph might have had about this cupbearer, remembering him, sort of went out the window. He might have been having questions and doubt and that lost hope. And we finally see that light at the end of the tunnel, where there's a need for Joseph to be brought up. So the Lord's with him and puts him into service. And one thing I noticed about this first interaction that we have between Pharaoh and Joseph is that immediately, before anything else is said by Joseph, he mentions that he doesn't have any power. He mentions that God is the one who has given him this ability to interpret these dreams, and that God has doubled his dream so that he knows that God is the one who's going to make all these things take place. And then later on in chapter 41, I'll skip over this one, but it's basically Joseph interpreting this dream, and Pharaoh realizes that he needs someone to be in charge of everything while they collect all this grain for 7 years. And they look, and Pharaoh says, well, we need someone with the Spirit of God in him. And they all say, oh, well, it's got to be Joseph. And that's basically the synopsis of that little section. But we look at Joseph, and he was a boy in a pit, thrown in by his brothers. And now he's in charge of the entirety of Egypt behind only Pharaoh himself. And I have a question. How did Joseph achieve this? And there's two answers. One, I'll just see what you have, but there's two answers that I've written down. So.
I never really thought about how you could be in a pit and it's not your fault. Like, this is nothing Joseph did to himself. I don't know if that's like very, very obvious to everyone else, but that is profound to me. And I think here he leaned on the Lord. He was faithful to him and put the Lord first in all of these opportunities where he was in terrible situations that he didn't like or choose and they weren't his fault. But he still decided to serve the Lord, and he could have sinned, he could have slipped and fallen, but I think like the key here is that God made his way, his path, like his way. And what an example for us. There's so many times in our life where we're in pits that are not self-inflicted too. So this is really encouraging. Thank you.
Yeah. So that's one of the things I had, that he remained faithful to God and gave him glory through all of that. And does anyone want to try and take a stab at what the other one that I had written down was? It's just he didn't do anything. It was God that did it all and put him in his position. And it's kind of a little trick question there, because obviously Joseph living his life for God is what he did, but God is the one who put him in the pit and brought him out in that cycle. And that's what I've got for our little Judges or our Joseph section. Spoilers for what's next. But does anyone have any comments they want to make about that? Yeah, Jake.
In the daily Bible reading this week, we read Habakkuk, and Joseph's life, I think, really like mirrors that a lot. Of Habakkuk says, like, what are you fixing to do about all this lawlessness? And God said, don't worry about it. I'm fixing to send the enemy to overtake y'all. He's like, what? And with Joseph, we see the same thing of, oh, they threw him in a pit. So what's the restoration? Going into slavery. Okay? So then we see he's thrown into the prison. So what's the restoration? He's the head of the prison. Oh, he has this chance of getting out of the prison, but what does he have to do? He has to wait 2 years before he's And so these restorations aren't necessarily things that like I think Joseph would have picked for himself. He wouldn't have said like, oh, I think selling me into slavery would be a good way to get me out of this pit. Or, oh, 2 years seems like a good amount of time for me to wait in this prison. And so it's building off of Mo's point, like, yes, oftentimes we're in pits that we don't design for ourselves, like it's not our fault that we're in these pits. But then oftentimes the restoration is not a restoration that we would have picked for ourselves. But Joseph is a good example because he takes that restoration that we consider subpar or not ideal, and he uses it for the glory of God. And then at the end is the ultimate glorification. And we're not promised that, like we read with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And even if God doesn't save me, still glory to him. But in whatever situation we're in, using it for the glory of God, even if we don't reach that, second home to Pharaoh.
Yeah. I think Miss Jeannie, did you have something?
Well, that also to something that Morgan said about Joseph not being responsible for his own problems. In the past, I have always wondered, Joseph, what is it with you when you had this dream? Why didn't you tell your brothers and your dad? That was just not smart. And so I kind of do think, well, Joseph, that was kind of your fault. But when you think about what Morgan said, he did it really, I think, in innocence. Like you said before, he was 17 years old, a boy at 17. And maybe at that time, that was like a more grown-up person than it is in our day. But I just think of a 17-year-old boy as not really having a whole lot of sense.
Yep.
Here.
Yep.
But dreams got him in trouble, but then dreams got him out of trouble too.
Yeah.
I like thinking about this class with what we did with the Promised Land. I think those match really cool because when you said that you're going to do captivity and restoration, I was ready for all of the physical. I'm going to take you out of the land, put you back in the land, take you out of the land, put you back, which does happen with Joseph. I mean, he is taken out and put in Egypt. But I love that his captivity is not always a removal from the land. His captivity can be an occupation or a relationship that's plundered. The occupation is not always removal from the land, and that's like a new thing for me right now.
Yeah.
Really cool.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on to our next one. Like I said, accidentally, is the cycle of the judges, and I couldn't get AI to make me a little picture for this one, so Google had to do me right. And from now on, really through the rest of the Old Testament, there's one problem that I sort of see that overlays everything, and we can look at that in Deuteronomy chapter 7. If you want to go ahead and turn there, Deuteronomy 7. And I'll read verses 1 through 5. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you're entering to take possession of it, and clear away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mighty than you. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you, and you defeat them, you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show them no mercy. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. But thus shall you deal with them. You shall break down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars and chop down their Asherim and burn their carved images with fire. Verse 2, devote them to complete destruction. And that's what we see basically through the rest of the Old Testament until the Israelites are taken out. The Israelites and the nation of Judah are taken out. We see time and time again there are people that they didn't take out of the land that sucked them back into idolatry or to intermarrying with the people. And it's just this whole cycle of them being stuck worshiping these idols. At this point, I think in Deuteronomy, Moses was preparing the people who were supposed to go into the land of Canaan across the Jordan, how they were supposed to live, rereading the law, reminding them of their 40-year journey and how they got there to where they were. And there was a new generation of Israelites who was going to be in the land that might not have necessarily been alive or conscious, I guess, around the events of Mount Sinai. And God had a plan for them. They were to go into the land. There would be no covenants with the people, show them no mercy, not to intermarry, and to go and break their altars and to burn their images. He wanted everything that those people were to be gone. He wanted everything that would remind them of someone other than God to be out of their way, because he knew what kind of people they were, and he knew that they were easily influenced, so he just wanted that gone. We fast forward to Judges 1. The book of Joshua is the conquest, right? It's the conquest of Canaan coming from the Jordan and sweeping through and taking all these nations city by city, destroying their people and striking fear into the hearts of all the people that live there. And the book starts, if you want to turn over to Joshua chapter 1. No, Judges chapter 1 is right. Turn over there real quick. The first heading that I have at the very beginning of the book is the continuing conquest of Canaan. So we get to the end of Joshua's life at the end of the book, the previous book, and there's still a little bit left to do. And then you might either turn a page or it might be on that same page. And the next heading is failure to complete the conquest. Manasseh and Zebulun and Naphtali, the house of Joseph, they allowed the people to stay, but they took them and forced them to do labor for them. And that's what God said, right? No, that's not what he said. Ephraim and Asher both allowed the people to live there as neighbors, not as laborers. And that's what God said, right? No, of course not. And then the tribe of Dan, they left them so numerous that they didn't commit the Amorites to labor or to dwell peacefully among them, but they were pushed back by the Amorites because they said, we don't want you in our land. So they pushed God's people away because they didn't fully commit to listening to what God knew, which we knew is not what God wanted to happen. And immediately following this, in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, God made the people and their gods a vice of sin for the Israelites. And that's what we see all throughout this cycle of Judges. And we see this in the latter days of the Kings. And we see it in different ways today, obviously, not through maybe physical idols, but the idols that we have in our lives. In the pattern, that's the pattern we see. Judges 1:10, there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work that he'd done for Israel. So we've taken the land, and a whole another cycle of people have come through who just don't know and need a reminder about God. And they become stuck in that loop, and that's what the judges are there to do. It's a loop of evil and condemnation and captivity for the other nations, to other nations and peoples. If someone wants to read Judges chapter 1, verses 11 through 15. Judges 1, 11 through 15.
From there they went against the inhabitants.
That's not the right verse. I won't make you read it. I'm sorry.
Did you say Judges 1?
I did say Judges 1. Yeah, I just
11?
read Judges 2, 11 through 15.
We'll try that.
Yeah, that one is right.
And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after the other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers, who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of God was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress.
Great, thank you. Exactly what God warned the people would happen is exactly what happened. They turned away from God. They served foreign and false gods. They were overtaken by enemies, and they were in this terrible distress. And that's that cycle that they're put in. A judge would come and save them and restore them to be with God all the days of that judge's life. But then the judge would die, and the people would forget, and over they'd go. And I kind of rushed through that, and I'm going to rush through this next one just to make sure that we can really get to our application super quick. But the next thing that I wanted to talk about was the divided kingdom. And we've discussed it, I think, a little bit already with bits and pieces. But just going through the Kings and the Chronicles, I just did sort of a quick scan at the beginning of a lot of the kings' lives. We have Jehu in 2 Kings 10. He wiped out the Baal in Israel, but he didn't destroy the calves at Dan and Bethel, and he was not careful to walk in the way of the Lord. And we see in verse 32 of that same chapter that this is where God sort of allows these outside people to start taking in the land that Solomon and David had so prosperously taken for the Israelites. We see Jehoahaz in 2 Kings 13. He did what was evil, and Israel suffered, so he pleaded to God, and he was restored. But then he comes back, and he didn't change his ways. Joash, an evil king. Jeroboam, an evil king. We have evil and evil and evil. It's this cycle of kings that we go through. And then we get to a king like Hezekiah in 2 Kings 18, who did what was right, and he removed these high places and destroyed the bronze serpent that people had begun to worship instead of being healed by. And the Lord was with him, and he prospered. But then his son Manasseh comes along, and he did evil, as you can probably guess. And he rebuilt these high places that his dad had taken down, and all these altars to the Baal and to the Asheroth. And God, for him, this is this last straw. He committed Judah and Jerusalem to destruction, that they'd be wiped clean as one wipes a dish. And the process starts, the Assyrians come in and they capture the king. And Manasseh cried out to God, and God is merciful and he's forgiving. So he forgives Manasseh and he brings him out of the land of the Assyrians. And Manasseh does a little bit. He builds the walls of Jerusalem back. He fortifies some cities in Judah. He took away the foreign gods, and he commanded all of Judah to serve Yahweh. But still, there were people that were making these sacrifices at places that they weren't supposed to. And we see a little sliver of hope with Josiah, but after that, everything is just downhill. And then they're taken into this 70 years of captivity in this foreign land. And I know I'm moving through this very, very fast, but I just want to get to our final point, which is the best point. And after this, we enter Ezra and Nehemiah, where King Cyrus has this decree that all the people should come back who were from the land, and they should build back up the temple because there was a message from God that they should. And Nehemiah comes back and he rebuilds the walls around Jerusalem. And they start to work to bring back their culture and their religion for the Jewish people, the practices, the observance of the Passover in Ezra 6, teaching the people the law in chapter 7. The priests and the Levites were appointed in Nehemiah 12. And there were people return to what was once a semi-part of their lives, or the lives of their ancestors. And because of this intervention that he had in the heart of man. And then, of course, we get to our last point. We get to King Jesus. And I'm just going to open the floor just so you guys can have these last couple of minutes to talk about what you see, where you see Christ in these stories with the flood and with Joseph and with the judges in divided kingdom, and how this idea of captivity and restoration sort of ties things together with you.
Like Joseph, when he was in the pit, suffered so much trial, tribulation, and things unjust, and all of these things ultimately were for the salvation of his people. His people were the ones that benefited from all these horrible things that he went through, and he was able to feed them through the famine and take care of them. Just like Jesus, all the bad things he endured, ultimately is for our salvation.
Yeah. I had the most fun going through the Joseph part. I don't know if you could tell I was more excited about talking about that one than the others, but it's just we have this whole theme of this pit and despair, and then restoration to being in a high place, to being by the King, and it's hard to not see Jesus in captive on the cross, and then in the pit, in the tomb, and then raised being by his Father in heaven in that land. Jesse.
I think it's fascinating. We've seen kind of two separate parties in this, where you've had people that were in captivity kind of incidentally, not by their own fault, like Noah and Joseph. And then you see people that like very much got themselves in trouble. And on the one hand, you can see like God's deliverance as just his sense of justice. But for the people that deserved the captivity they were in and God restored them, you're seeing God's grace. The fact that God's willing to extend that to us when we fully deserve to be punished is just exemplary of his character.
Yeah. I'll do Ryan, and then I have one more verse, and then we'll be finished.
The literal rejection by his family, they like, oh, is this your son? And like, no, he's crazy. He's a crazy person. But then after the resurrection, what an honor it would be to restore him back to the sonship.
Yeah. The verse I've got to end out class is Matthew 11:28 through 30. And it says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Jesus came for us. He came to restore us from captivity, from condemnation to hell, from sin, because he loves us. Thanks so much.